You're listening to a bonus episode of the Naked Mole Rat podcast by Libu Studio. I'm Ilya Kolmanovsky. It's a bi-weekly podcast about scientific discovery and people behind it. It comes out in Russian and usually tops all the different charts in the Russian segment, but we do publish full versions of the recorded interviews with world-known experts. So please tap to rate us on Apple Podcasts and add comments. It is very important for us that people find out about this podcast. Naked Mole Rat podcast. Spread the word. This episode has a guest star, or a star guest as I'd rather put it, Professor Svante Pääbo from Max Planck Institute in Leipzig. His most well-known achievement is having mastered the extraction of ancient DNA and reading it. His group was first to sequence the genome of the Neanderthal. And Pääbo's work has brought to life many interesting peculiarities of these extinct people, and then came COVID. And ironically, it's great news for Pääbo, because there was this massive effort to find some gene that can tell your fortune, predict aggravated or light outcome of this new infection. You know, nature has staged a massive experiment with humans. And however tragic that is, it is also a chance to find something new about our genes, get statistics. And this is for us. But for Pääbo, well, whenever we learn something new about the genes of sapiens, Pääbo wants to check if Neanderthal heritage is involved. And the answer is yes. Pääbo's group has found out that a surprisingly common variant on chromosome 3 that predicts bad outcome of COVID is a Neanderthal variant. It is actually responsible for many deaths in the world now. Pääbo calls this revenge from Neanderthals. But half a year later, some good news came. There's also a Neanderthal gene that some people carry on a 12th chromosome that makes you more resistant against COVID, although just a little bit. I called Svante Pääbo to discuss all that.
My name is Svante Pääbo, and I'm a molecular geneticist that work at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology in Leipzig in Germany.
Of course, we know about your outstanding work on Neanderthals and Denisovans, but then the pandemic has started. Tell us, how did this idea of COVID study came around?
Well, so one of the people in our lab, Hugo Seberg, was involved in a big international consortium to study the genetic predisposition to becoming severely ill when you're infected with SARS-CoV-2. And since we have sequenced the Neanderthal genomes and are very interested in the consequences of Neanderthal variants today, we sort of more or less routinely check new variants that come up and have associations with disease or other phenotypes in present-day people. And we were extremely shocked in June last year when we then found that this locus on chromosome 3 that is associated with increased risk to become severely ill with COVID actually comes from Neanderthals, the risk variant, the one that predisposes you to be more likely to become severely ill if you're infected. So we then studied that locus and found that there is 50,000 base pairs there that come from Neanderthals. And it occurs outside Africa, but its distribution is also very interesting. So it's, for example, around 16% of people carry this variant in Europe and Western Russia. In South Asia, it's very common. So that about 65% of people in Bangladesh, for example, carry this. And in stark contrast to that, in China or Japan, is absent. So that sort of clearly suggests that this locus has been important in the past and have been selected. Negatively selected, so it's lost in East Asia, in Japan and China. You can speculate, of course, that maybe coronaviruses have been endemic there and there have been previous pandemics or epidemics there that have eliminated this. In South Asia, it's most likely have been positive, and we don't know why. But you could, of course, speculate that something that's bad in certain infections might be positive in others. There are things such as cholera, for example, and have been present for a long time in that part of the world. And some genes in this area on chromosome 3 have been implicated in inflammations in the intestine. So you may perhaps speculate that it has been positive, say, if you're infected with cholera.
But how did we acquire it in the first place?
Acquire this variant from Neanderthals?
Yeah.
Well, I think that in general, the ancestors of people outside Africa mixed with Neanderthals when they met, something 50, 60,000 years ago. They then acquired random fragments of the Neanderthal genome, and some of these turned out to have positive effects. Perhaps because Neanderthals had lived for hundreds of thousands of years outside Africa and had adapted to the environment there. And a big factor in that environment may indeed have been infectious diseases, pathogens that existed there and not inside Africa. And that when that was the case, those variants, of course, increased in frequency in modern humans. And that's probably what we see in the case of this chromosome 3 locus, for example, that it became rather frequent in Europe and very frequent in South Asia. We have since, of course, found this other region on chromosome 12 that today is protective against severe COVID. Unfortunately, that effect is smaller. The risk locus on chromosome 3 about doubles your risk to become severely ill or die if you're infected. The protective variant from Neanderthals on chromosome 12 reduces your risk with about 20%. So the effect is about 5 times smaller. But there it's the same thing. That variant is quite frequent and actually everywhere outside Africa, varying between 30 to 50% of people carry this variant in Europe, Asia, and so on.
So that's probably something good.
Yes, and in that case, one actually understands the mechanism. This fragment, the Neanderthal version, encompasses 3 genes that are well known to be involved in degrading double-stranded RNA. And the viral genome is, of course, made up of RNA, so this is a well-known mechanism to defend against RNA virus infections.
And it comes from Neanderthals?
Well, a variant of it comes from Neanderthals. And that variant seems to be more efficient in degrading RNA. And it's actually the ancestral variant. It's quite interesting. So
ancestral.
Modern and evolved in Africa lost the more effective variant, probably because it's costly to maintain it. Neanderthals kept it, probably because it was advantageous outside Africa. And then when modern humans met Neanderthals outside Africa, they reacquired this variant, if you like.
Wow.
That is shared with apes and other mammals.
Wow, amazing, unbelievable. And as for the chromosome 3 locus,
this last thing I talked about now is the chromosome 12 locus.
Yeah, I got that. I got it. And if we go back to the chromosome 3, why do you think Neanderthals evolved this variant? Is there any way to speculate about why it could be useful to them?
No, and it's a very interesting question. There are several regions in the genes in this region. For at least 2 of them, one could have reasonable hypotheses. So one gene that's encoded in here is a membrane protein that sits in the cell membrane. It's involved in transporting an amino acid into the cell, but it forms a complex with a protein called ACE2, which is a receptor for the SARS-CoV-2 virus. So since these 2 proteins sit together in the cell membrane, one could imagine that having more or less of this protein, for example, makes for more or less of ACE2, the receptor of the virus on the cell surface. So that's one line of research that we and others are now investigating. There are some other genes in this region that encode signal molecules in the immune system, cytokines. And of course, one idea about why one becomes severely ill and may die in COVID is that the immune system sort of overreacts. There is this cytokine storm one talks about. So it may also be that perhaps some of these signal molecules are sort of overproduced. So that's another line of research that many people are now pursuing.
So why do you think Neanderthals have evolved both of these traits?
Well, I would then sort of speculate that they sort of kept this because it was advantageous in some other infection.
What could be a mechanism here?
Well, we don't know the mechanism. So we don't know why you become more sick with this variant. So we are speculating about that it has to do with that protein that binds the viral receptor, or maybe with the genes encoding this signal substances for the immune system. But that is really something that we are studying very intensely now. We're trying to look in people who are heterozygotes, so who carry from one of their parents this risk variant and from the other parent the protective variant, and see if we can see some difference in how the genes are regulated, the maternal and paternal genes in such individuals.
Right. Professor, did you know about these interesting variants before the pandemic? Were you aware about it?
No, and particularly the chromosome 3 region wasn't known at all that it's involved in defense against infectious diseases. For chromosome 12, it was known that it's involved in defense against RNA viruses. It was also known that some variants there come from Neanderthals, but not, of course, how this would react in the SARS-CoV-2 infection.
So the pandemic sort of pointed you to something important to be learned about Neanderthals.
Yes.
Quite remarkable, isn't it?
Yes. And it's sort of remarkable, if you like, that, I sometimes think about Neanderthals. They disappeared 40,000 years ago, but they then still have a big, important influence on us today. And you can even calculate the approximate number of excess deaths that have happened worldwide due to this Neanderthal risk variant by looking at the frequency with which it occurs and the death rates in different parts of the world. And it's in the order of 200,000 extra deaths that have occurred due to this Neanderthal variant. It's the revenge of the Neanderthals, if you like.
Unbelievable. But also some lives saved.
Yes, thanks to this chromosome 12 protective locus, yes.
Can we estimate
and that's
how many?
Also, the effect is smaller per individual, but because it's so frequent and present everywhere outside Africa, it's sort of a big factor.
If you were to sort of describe the immune system of Neanderthals compared to sapiens, how would you describe it?
Well, I think we have no global view about that. In the case of SARS-CoV-2, we have these inklings now. There are some other variants that people have described that, for example, increases your risk for allergic diseases, for allergies, but that also protects you against ulcers, so infections with Helicobacter pylori that cause ulcers in your stomach, for example. So there are sort of interesting differences, but I would say they are pretty much like us, but we're adapted to a bit different environment and a different spectrum of pathogens, probably.
So how different it was? From what you hear, from what you say, I hear they needed to fight Helicobacter. Is that correct? They were exposed to Helicobacter.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
What about allergies? Why did they develop these nasty genes?
Well, I don't know. Probably the allergies you experience is a side effect or an unwanted effect of some defense variant that will defend you against some pathogens that may have been very bad in the past or may still be important.
Mm-hmm.
And we don't know that. We, of course, don't understand why we develop allergies.
I see. I understand.
So, talking Pääbo made me aware of this very intriguing and convoluted story of our immunity. I suddenly realized that adaptation to the environment is to a big degree adaptation to the landscape of parasites and infections. But of course, our main system that adapts us to live where we live is our brain. How was Neanderthal brain different? Well, there is an amazing study by Alison Mottry, who's trying to grow Neanderthal brains in petri dishes at his lab in San Diego. I wanted to see what is Pääbo's take on that experiment.
May I ask you to comment on a couple of papers which did not come from your lab, but I'm sure you have followed that. One is this new paper by Mottry Lab on Neanderthal organoids. Did it come across your desk?
Yes.
What do you think of it?
Well, I'm actually very surprised that you see such big effects when you change a single amino acid in one single gene. We have done and published work here where we do these brain organoids comparing humans and chimpanzees to look at how they differ. And we see very subtle, small differences. There's nothing we see in the microscope. When we in a very detailed study how stem cells divide, we can find some small differences. Here they change, not something that changed to the chimp, but they change a single thing, a single amino acid, and see huge effects that you even see in the microscope. I think it will be very interesting to see what this tells us. I'm sort of very surprised, actually.
But in general, what do you think? Maybe there is some more general knowledge. How was Neanderthal brain different from sapiens brain?
Well, what we know is that it was as big as the brain of present-day people. It had a bit different shape. It was more oblong. There was some subtle differences in the size of the cerebellum relative to the rest of the brain, for example. But overall, its sort of form is not that different from present-day people. You can probably find people today that have brains that look pretty much the same.
And not be able to tell from their behavior?
Yes, no. Mm-hmm.
What do you think in general of Neanderthal from the point of view of neuroscience? How was it different?
Well,
functionally,
I think my bias is to think that there were some subtle but important differences. It always strikes me that Neanderthals existed for hundreds of thousands of years, and Denisovans the same. Yet they didn't develop, culture and technology that changed very rapidly, nor did they spread across the whole globe. And that modern humans appear, and start spreading 60, 70,000 years ago. And then in a much shorter time, start spreading across water where you don't see land on the other side. They start developing technology that changes so rapidly as it becomes regionalized. An expert can easily see differences between Central Asia and Europe, for example, in the stone technology of modern humans, whereas when Neanderthals lived in the same areas, it looked pretty much the same because their technology changed so slowly, so it was sort of homogeneous geographically. Uh-huh. So I think there is something there. What that is really not known. It may not be that Neanderthals individually were less smart than what we are. It may be, if we speculate, something to do with social interactions. It may be that modern humans were much more into influencing others, forming big groups, transmitting knowledge between generations, for example, as some people speculate, but we don't know.
Could it be, on the other hand, that Neanderthals were better at something else or had more complex brain in their own way?
Yes, that could certainly be. But since we don't have any Neanderthals around, it is very hard to ask that question.
But growing their brains in the lab?
Well, I would tend to say that when you grow these brain organoids, they sort of represent early stages in brain development, right? And I would think that, yes, you might be able to see some differences to, say, a chimpanzee who has a brain that's 30% smaller than others. That's probably something that has to start rather early on in development, that difference. Neanderthals, I would much more speculate that whatever difference one might find might be something in a more mature brain that comes later in development, or even during when you grow up as a child.
But if technology permits, maybe we will be able to see much more mature Neanderthal brain, wouldn't we?
Maybe, but it will be a long time, I think, before we have that.
Would you like to see it?
Well, I think one would much more be interested in modeling certain aspects of the brain, say having neurons and glia cells that interact with each other in tissue culture that you have Neanderthalized, for example, but not as a whole brain, but really as cells interacting with each other, how they signal to each other, and so on.
Fascinating. Thank you so much for your time. I really enjoyed talking to you.
No problem. Thank you very much.
As we say in Russian, past is unpredictable. It seems like we cannot go through any new experience without looking back at Neanderthal legacy and always finding out something surprising about them and about ourselves. This was the Naked Mallrat podcast bonus episode by Libu Libu Studio. I'm Ilya Kolmanovsky. Goodbye.